over at BangTheBook.com. We are your one-stop shop for sports betting news and information. Lots of great stuff going on over there right now, including that daily Kyle Hunter piece with his college basketball selections, Parker Michaels' daily NHL picks, NFL power ratings, NBA and college basketball previews, NBA, NHL, and college basketball situational betting articles, our free pick contests, all kinds of betting tools over there to help you bang the books here in 2019. So you definitely want to make sure that you check that stuff out. Also, we're going to be getting a head start on some of our Major League Baseball content here this month, so you can keep an eye out for that as well. As you know, this and every edition of Bang the Book Radio presented by our friends over at DSI Sportsbook. If you sign up at DSI using that promo code BTB and the number 200, 100% deposit match bonus for the sportsbook up to $500, 100% deposit match bonus for the live casino up to $500. At BetDSI, it's only a game until you bet it. We got two guests on the program here today. The first, Rolf Michaels from WagerTalk.com. Again, we're going to chat national championship and college basketball with conference play going on. So here is that segment with Rolf Michaels from WagerTalk.com. All right, I'm joined now by Rolf Michaels, professional handicapper over at WagerTalk.com. Rolf, how's it going today, man?
Going great, Adam. Thanks for having me on. And, conference basketball, no better time of the year for me than to enjoy these great schedules week in and week out and having some excellent conferences of college hoops.
Well, obviously, we're going to throw everybody off here by having you on this week on Friday instead of on Tuesday, but with Christmas and New Year's Day, didn't have you on the last 2 weeks. So good to get you on the program here for this Friday edition of the show. And before we get into college basketball, let's chat the national championship game over in the college football betting market. When I recorded with Brad Powers on Thursday, we still had several -6s out there in the market. As you and I are recording here on Thursday afternoon, only one -6 out there. That's at Bovada. Not a surprise. The rest of the market, 5 and 5.5. So what do you make of that, Rolf?
Well, I think there's only one reason that the line is where it's at, and that is because Oklahoma covered against Alabama. Alabama got out to the 28-0 lead. When they opened up the bowl lines at the beginning of December, they opened up this game 7.5. They made a line at the Superbook. You could bet Alabama -7.5 to Clemson. People bet that down to 7, and it was close to going to 6.5. Because of Clemson's results with Pittsburgh and Notre Dame the last couple weeks, because of what Alabama did against Georgia and Oklahoma, we've seen an adjustment of at least a point. And I think also some people probably look at what Georgia did against Texas and think, well, look, Alabama beat a Georgia team that wasn't very good that beat Texas. So, again, the line continues to climb down for the Tigers.
Yeah, and, it's very dangerous to do that. I mean, I know you were on Texas and the Golden Nugget, and that was the game that pushed you up into the money to getting your money back there, and congratulations for that. But, Georgia had no interest really in being there, at least not until the second half when they kind of woke up a little bit and sort of made that game closer than the final score would indicate. I don't think that's really a reflection on Alabama. So I think people that are following that line of thought are really, putting themselves in a tough spot here. What about Rolf Michaels? What does Rolf Michaels think about this game with Alabama -5, -5.5?
Well, I liked Clemson +7. I didn't bet it at the Superbook, but I certainly, I did a video on it for Wager Talk, and we talked about it, and I said I will bet Clemson, and I just didn't get to pulling that trigger and doing it. I think Clemson is still the right side. It is tough to win a national championship twice, and that's why the underdog is 4-0 in the championship game since we've gone to the finals. Alabama won a couple years ago. Clemson comes in with the chip on their shoulder. Can Bama win it twice? No, Clemson wins it. Last year, Alabama comes in with the chip on the shoulder. Can Clemson win it twice? No, and Alabama wins it. Of course, Alabama won without covering as a favorite. I think the defenses are even in this game. What I do like about the Clemson defense is they've been superior. They have held 7 opponents to a season low this year and another 3 opponents to a season number 2 low, including Notre Dame and Pittsburgh. When you can get that type of pressure with 51 sacks and a sack percentage of 12.4 compared to Alabama's sack percentage of 10.4, I think you have a difference there. And also we both know that teams are going to score. We know Alabama's defense can get scored on, allowing 28 to Georgia and 34 to Oklahoma. Clemson's offense, I would put just behind Oklahoma's in that range. And we know that Alabama's offense is going to be able to score, even though, the Clemson defense has been stellar. They did give up 35 yards against South Carolina, allowing 500 yards passing. They did play another pass offense in Texas A&M. They allowed 430 yards passing and allowed 501 yards per game. So, I think both teams are going to be able to move the ball, but I think it's going to be more of moving it between the 20s. I think we're going to see more field goals than people expect. And I'm happy to take the points with the Tigers in what I think will be a game where, again, a lot of field goals kicked. I'll be looking at playing the props for over-unders and field goals, and I think I'll be playing that over the total.
Well, you mentioned Clemson 52 sacks, Alabama 45. Clemson third in yards per game on offense, Alabama fourth. Alabama second in yards per play, Clemson third. Clemson number one in the country in yards per carry, Alabama 18th. But Alabama led the country in yards per pass attempt and will lead the country in passing touchdowns if they get a couple here in this game. So, both of these teams, very, very proficient on offense and defense. In the prop market, and I think that's something I want to expand on a little bit here for a couple of minutes, because as I've mentioned to listeners here, both in my preview and on yesterday's show, this is basically like the Super Bowl now when it comes to the amount of props that are out there. So, you mentioned that you're looking for some field goal props and things of that sort. What about the way that this game plays out? Do you think that there's a mismatch at a skill position? Do you feel like one of the two quarterbacks has a big day, or both quarterbacks have a big day? What are you looking for in the prop market?
Well, one thing I can tell you is this. We know that the Super Bowl props have ballooned to be just a betting force out here. And what happens in the market is, so often they don't put enough time into those props. They look at what last year's were, and they make small adjustments in the Super Bowl prop. Well, the college football props are new to the scene. And if they look at the last couple years and make small adjustments, I think you're going to have an advantage to the over, with Alabama's offense playing at such a historic rate and their defense not being up to par. So, I do believe that I'll be looking for some overs, as far as looking at the rushing and the passing and the receiving numbers. It's a market that's still relatively new. It's a market that if you get those numbers first and you start looking at value, I think the props are clearly the place for you to get value. A couple things you look at with the Clemson receivers. Well, someone like T. Higgins, who had 9 receptions his last couple games. The first 4 weeks he only had 9 receptions. So you've got a guy coming on there at the end. But you have to look at current form, look at what coaches went to what receivers late in the year when these games meant more against their rivals the last week, in the conference championships, and in the first playoff games. I think those trends tend to carry over. So when I'm looking at player props, I tend to look at the game-by-game situations for those key players for the last 3 or 4 weeks and make my assessments based on those, and not the year-to-date stats.
One last thing I'll ask you about here with regards to the national championship. Where does this number go? I mean, right now it looks like we've got some sharp money out there on Clemson, driving this number down from 6 to 5.5 or 5. You mentioned that you've got a lean towards Clemson at the very least. Brad mentioned the same thing on yesterday's show. So Clemson does look like the sharper of the two sides in this game, at least for right now. What do you think? Do we just sit in this dead zone between 4 and 6?
I think it'll come down. I think you're going to get some Clemson money. I think you're going to get some people. I think you're going to get the continued wave of Clemson, and if anything, it comes down. Will it get under 4? I don't think so. I think it will come down to 4 in my estimation. one of those 31-27 kind of scores people can imagine, and it gets past 4. But I think that if you want to play Clemson, I would suggest playing it now. And if you want to play Bama, which sounds weird because we know the whole world loves Bama, but perception is what have you done for me lately, and the Georgia and Oklahoma games are on people's minds. So I think anything, the public's going to be with the dog, betting the dog on the money line and betting the dog, as the 4-0 record gets more and more publicized that the dog is 4-0 in championship games, I think that translates into later Clemson money.
Before we move over to the college basketball side of things, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. I asked Brad Powers this same question on yesterday's show, and I do like to do this with our guests when we get to the end of a season. College football season, looking back at 2018 for Rolf Michaels here, sort of, it's the time of the year to do that kind of thing too, with this being the new year. What do you feel like you did really well in college football this year, Rolf?
I made a good adjustment sticking with some teams after losses. And what that means is, a team that I like that lost, many times I would not go back to them the next week worrying about customers saying, well, how can you give that team out back-to-back weeks? We lost last week, we'll lose again. I think my season had so much success this year because I wasn't afraid to go back to those situations of playing on a team which maybe had a bad loss, playing on them again, and even some situations where I was on the right side and I may have lost back-to-back games, and I still went back to them a third time. You can't be afraid to stick with what you know is right. If you've handicapped the game properly and you had a couple bad beats and you clearly have the better team this week, don't be afraid to play that game, even if you lost on that team last week or in some cases the last 2 weeks. If there's value on that game, on that week, make sure you stick to your guns and play it.
Well, and that's an important thing, and that's something I've mentioned here before, and I understand this is a results-based business, especially for people that sell selections and then, people worried about their personal bankrolls, but not every bet that loses is a bad bet. I mean, there's a lot of variance involved. There's a reason why the best in the world hit 55, 56, 57% long-term, which means losing 43 to 45% of the time, because you still have to go up against variance or turnover luck or injuries or whatever else. So for all of our listeners out there, keep that in mind that not every bet that loses lost because it was a bad bet. And you certainly want to make sure that you're looking into the reasons why. History and turnover margin, an injury that you couldn't account for, something like that. Like you said, Rolf, maybe some value coming back on that team the next week. So the obvious follow-up question here then, Rolf, is what do you feel like you could do better with college football in 2019? What adjustment are you going to look to make?
Well, it's almost going to be the same scenario, and this time I did back off a little bit. I'm a more contrarian player in college football, and therefore I like unders. And early in the year, my over-under record was not good. There was so much scoring early, and even though numbers were inflated, I had some double overtime, triple overtime losses, 21 points in the last 2-minute type losses. And in those specific weeks where we go from non-conference play to conference play, I was hesitant and left a lot of total winners off the board because the most value when you're betting over-unders, when you make the transition from non-conference to conference, especially a team like, in the SEC, you have an LSU team that, had a new quarterback that played some big non-conference games, scored a lot of points. You get into conference play and you start fading those unders. I left too many of those winners off the board in that early October range that I really regret now.
All right, so speaking of conference play, we can talk about that here on the college basketball side of things. And, we've had a lot of non-conference data points now, and obviously, you have to put those in the right context. So I imagine that's what the bulk of your work has been here on the college basketball side. How do you evaluate the body of work that we've seen so far from these teams as they now head into conference play?
Well, right now I basically look at their records. I reanalyze each conference now from top to bottom. I want to look at their records. I want to look at their strength of schedule. I want to look at their scoring, and I want to look at their rebounding. And I basically relook or reevaluate my power rating numbers based on that. One thing I want to forewarn some people on, strength of schedule. There's probably the easiest and one of the best numbers to me are the KenPom numbers. They're up there for free. It's just KenPom.com. I use them often. I use their adjusted offense, defense, tempo, and their strengths of schedule. But their strengths of schedule sometimes can be deceiving because when you're playing and you're looking at how a team does now, when you're getting into conference play and you're comparing teams and you're comparing strength of schedules can be so different in themselves where a team may have played a couple top 10 opponents and got blown out and played a couple non-lower division teams and blew them out versus a team that may have played 4 MAC-type teams in the 120 range and had better competition because they were challenged all 4 games instead of 2 blowout wins and 2 blowout losses. So you also have to evaluate, even though you're looking at a number and you think this is a number that I can compare teams to, you have to take it a step further and I like looking at how many competitive games the teams played based on lines between, let's say, the 7s or 8s, or even a single-digit favorite all the way to a single-digit dog. So, to me, when you're looking at conference play, that's one thing. Secondly is the style of play. We have a lot of teams that play, up-tempo basketball when it gets to non-conference play. One example I think is Michigan State this year. Michigan State's 12-2, and if you're used to watching Michigan State scoring, right now they have the 3rd most efficient offense. They're running at a 70 tempo, number 70 in the country. They've scored 99, 100 points, 81, and 88 their last 4 games. Well, last year they're the number 234 team in tempo. So you have a team like Michigan State that's had a lot of overs now, but when you get into conference play, playing teams that are familiar with how you run sets, know your personnel, you're playing them twice a year, you're going to see a big shift in that tempo number, and those numbers that went up early went up last year. I'm looking at Michigan State's last year numbers now. Well, from December 18th to December 31st last year, they played Houston Baptist, Long Beach State, Cleveland State, and Savannah State. What happened? They scored 100 or more points in all 4 of those games. Later on in the year, you're going to see those 76 points scored against Wisconsin, 74 against Maryland, 76 against Penn State, 63 against Indiana. So you have to make those adjustments from how teams play non-conference, especially when you're the superior or inferior team, to when you start playing conference action.
Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you about is, what changes with your handicapping mentality, once you get into conference play. And it feels like that's a thing where, the games do tighten up a little bit because there is more emphasis on each and every game, especially if you're in a one-bid league where you really need to win games for seeding for your conference tournament. Things do tighten up a little bit. And, also, too, it's one of those things where, from a side standpoint, I want to get your thoughts on this. I don't know if you've studied it or anything like that, but I feel like in the non-conference, there's probably less fouling at the end of games because some of these non-conference games, they're paycheck games or they don't matter as much or something like that. I feel like this would be the time of the year where, since everybody has a shot in conference, you may get some more of those late foul fests.
Yeah, I can agree with that thought. I've never looked at that or, I'm speaking just off the top of my head as far as references go. But I would think in that case, Adam, that you probably even have more of that situation early because no matter what newspaper you're going to read or no matter what coach you're going to see a quote from, every coach is going to say the exact same thing. Slate is clear. We're 0-0 starting play tomorrow or tonight in our conference opener. we have as much chance to win as any other team in the conference. You hear that exact same line from every person. So when you're 0-0, or when you don't have a losing record, or when you have a shot to lead the division, I think you have that mentality of playing that way to the final buzzer, much more so than maybe later on in conference play, when you're 3-12 playing a conference opponent that's 12-3 and you're down by 10 with a minute and a half to go. You may not have that same mentality of fouling to the very last second.
Now let's speak in generalities here for a couple of minutes about conference play and just scheduling spots that are out there. And there are a lot of things here where you take the Big Sky, for example. There are some schools that are in very, very high elevation. There are some that aren't. Conference USA, the way that road games are grouped, stuff like that. So, what are some things that, maybe you don't have as many specific examples, or maybe we don't have teams that are doing that this weekend or early next week, but just in general, what are some spots you found in conference play that you do really like?
Well, one of the things you brought up, what are the elevation, and no one's bigger than the Mountain West. Having the Western Division and the Mountain Division. If you're playing New Mexico, and people don't think of altitude in New Mexico, but New Mexico's 5,000 feet, the same as Mile High Stadium in Denver that everyone talks about the Broncos with altitude. Then you have Wyoming at 7,000 feet. Well, add in now with the Mountain West, I think you're going to have a lot of situations with Nevada being as publicized as they are, where teams are going to have that bullseye on Nevada this year. So, I'll have to look closely at how teams do the game before they play Nevada to see if there is any look ahead to playing them, how teams do after playing them, especially if you're playing Nevada, which has altitude, and then playing another altitude situation before or after. So, it clearly is a situation where I think when you have some elite teams, and even Fresno this year has put themselves in a situation where, they're not a two-conference league unless Nevada doesn't win the Mountain West, and then they would be a two-conference league. But Fresno has that bullseye on their back as well. So a lot of times when you have a dominant team in a conference, I look to see how those teams are reacting at the start of the conference play, playing that superior team before or after.
Well, and of course, keep in mind, too, and some of this kind of obvious, but, the Pac-12 with the altitude double in Colorado and Utah, you've got the Big West where teams have to go out to Hawaii. A lot of these situational spots in conference play that you want to pay close attention to. And, of course, one other thing that I think we can touch on real quickly here, Rolf, a lot of home-road dichotomies when it comes to college basketball where conference-wide, teams are just better at home than they are on the road.
Yeah, and bringing it up, let's bring out the number one point first. I love playing against teams that aren't road tested, and their first road test is in conference action. In fact, there are still two teams that have not played a road game in college basketball. Number one is Duke. Duke hasn't played a true road game. Their first true road game will be Tuesday the 8th at Wake Forest. And a team we're going to talk about, as one of my best bets on Saturday, West Virginia has not played a true road game. Their first true road game is this Saturday at Texas. And now while you're used to some other teams, a Kansas, a Texas Tech, a Texas, those teams haven't played road games, but there are three teams from the non-major conferences that have only played one true road game. That was very surprising to me. Duquesne is in one of those situations. Duquesne's only played one true road game. That was Notre Dame back on the 20th of November. This Saturday, they're at Davidson. Hawaii has only played one road game. Thursday the 17th, they're at Cal State Northridge for their second. And UNLV, again, only one road game, and that was at Hawaii as part of a tournament as well. So no real true road game. They're playing at New Mexico on January 8th. So, right now there are 34 teams that have played zero or only one true road game. When you find some of those weaker teams, Washington State's another team that comes to mind. They've only played one. They've struggled away from home, and they're a mediocre team that has some wins against non-division foes. Now they're going to play a conference opponent on the road when that first road game happens. I love those situations when handicapping early in January.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I'm looking at the Big West right now, and collectively as a conference, they are 8-48 in road games here so far this year, and UC Irvine has 5 of those wins. So 56 road games already for the Big West. The Big 12 as a whole, 16 road games here so far. So a lot of Big 12 teams not exactly battle-tested on the road. So I know you mentioned you got a couple of plays that you like for Friday that have kind of caught your attention a little bit. Pretty small card here on Friday, but what are you looking at?
Well, Friday I just have couple angles for couple games. I haven't looked at the Friday card in whole. I do have couple games for Saturday, including the one we talked about. But couple interesting angles just to bring up for Friday action. And again, we talk about home road dichotomy. And while KenPom only lists tempo as far as overall, I really like to break down how teams do offensively and defensively at home and on the road. Cal Poly's one of those teams at home that scores a lot. They shoot well at home. Their defense is mediocre. They're 11-1 to the over at home in their last 12 games. And Ball State now is also 10-2-1 their last 13 games to the over. Both of those games on Friday, again, you never want to base a game on an angle, but if that angle gets you looking at a situation that occurs, obviously there's some benefit from it. So those are just 2 angles that come up with those few games on Friday. On Saturday, there are a couple games I like. The first is West Virginia. West Virginia is traveling to Texas, and I like Texas in this spot. West Virginia burned me on Wednesday night. I played against them, against Texas Tech. Texas Tech was laying 3.5 or 4, only won that game by 3. I was playing more against West Virginia than I was playing on Texas Tech, but I will not be afraid to fade West Virginia this year. People think, well, with Big Huggy there, they're that same type of team, but they're not. They're 8-5 this year, and they have really struggled. They're neutral games this year. Western Kentucky, a loss. Florida, a loss. Rhode Island, a loss. They're missing their 2 guards graduated from last year. They are not the same defense without those guards. They are not the same offense without those guards. And now they're playing again their first true road game this Saturday against Texas. I like the Longhorns, and I think, with their top 10 defense and Shaka Smart having him playing now the way he wants them to play. They went through a stretch earlier where they lost to Michigan State, lost to Radford, and lost to Virginia Commonwealth, a 3-game stretch in a row. But I think those problems are solved. They're a young team in the middle. I mean, they start 2 sophomores and a freshman in the middle, so those road games early don't affect me. Texas, again, I like. And another situation is I'm going to call for Iowa State to knock off Kansas. Iowa State, a team that a lot of people picked to be good this year. They finished last in the Big 12 last year, but I really like what they're doing in this year. They got Lindell Winnington back, their best player. He's only back for his third game now. They're already 11-2. They played well, winning at Oklahoma State on Wednesday. They got beat both times last year by Kansas. They'll be ready in Hilton Coliseum. Kansas is a team, yes, they're 12-1, but even in their games that they've won convincingly, they've struggled. Against New Mexico State, a 3-point win. Eastern Michigan ended up being a 24-point win, but it wasn't that close. Their Wednesday game against Oklahoma, they won by 7. That was a back-and-forth battle. Yes, they have a top 20 offense. Yes, they have a top 20 defense, but they really haven't put it together. Their only other road game this year was at Arizona State. That was a loss in itself. So 2 Big 12 teams, like you said, that haven't been tested on the road. I'm going to back both Iowa State and Texas at home on Saturday.
Well, and for West Virginia here, as you mentioned, no true road game yet. 3 of the next 4 on the road, 2 of them in the state of Texas, and that game on Saturday night 9 o'clock Eastern time start. So not only is it a true road game, but a little bit of an interruption to the body clock there for the Mountaineers as well. Rolf Michaels, professional handicapper over at WagerTalk.com. What's going on over there right now, Rolf?
Football winding down, had a great finish to the season. College basketball getting back under gear. I neglected to get up a college basketball guide this past week. Thought I would have it up for the new year, but by the time we talk next Tuesday, make sure you're looking for this weekend at Wager Talk, and I will be having a college basketball guide put out weekly, just with records and ATSs and how teams have done in a previous period of time. And the NBA stat sheet up daily for free and daily plays, WagerTalk.com.
Well, so make sure you check out Wager Talk, and you can also follow Rolf on Twitter, and he's a very good Twitter follow at CalSportsLV. Rolf Michaels, appreciate the time as always, bud. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll talk to you again on Tuesday.
Thanks, Adam.